Welcome to the Unlist. Today, we're going to have a conversation about a topic that can get really heated with some people. So I'm going to ask you very kindly to keep any discussion you have in the comments civil. All right? If you disagree with something I have to say or disagree with something that someone else in the comment section has to say, do so with respect, okay? Because if you disagree with me respectfully, I'm going to reply to you respectfully as well. If you come at me with a personal attack or you get ugly, then I'm just going to block and possibly report your comment if it's abusive. It violates terms of YouTube usage anyway. So let's not pull knives out, okay? Very controversial topics in the fragrance community tend to bring out the knives. And I'm just letting you know that I have a zero tolerance policy for that. So I don't beat nobody else up. So ain't no one gonna be beating me up either. It ain't happening. All right, that's not how we play. This is not, kindergarten. This is not fifth grade playground where we can push little Timmy into the sand, rub his face in the sand. We're not doing that, okay? We are adults here, so let's act like it. Now, moving on. Gender in fragrance tends to be very controversial because, at least right now in the times we live in, any conversation involving gender tends to become one that spirals outward into a political conversation, and oftentimes a religious one as well. It ultimately devolves into, do you have the right to exist or should you not exist? That's what it ends up being that argument. And we're not here to have that argument today. Those of you who know my political beliefs and views, you know my sexual orientation, you know where I stand on things, you already know. So knowing those things, if you're here watching this video, you should know how I feel, and if you disagree with that, then I'm not even sure why you're here. Well, you can still disagree with me politely once again in these things, but as far as human rights and stuff are concerned, I don't budge with that. So let's not take it there, because I'm not taking it there. All right? Strictly fragrance. Gender in fragrance. All right? Now, let's get going here. So, I typically hang my hat on base notes. I'm not on Fragrantica. So, I have my reasons for not being there. But since I'm not there, I don't know how the discourse goes on Fragrantica when it comes to gender. So, those of you who do use Fragrantica and you want to tell me all about how that works, please do. Tell me what the discourse there is in the comment section. Share with me what the discourse involving gender and perfumes tends to be. I'd love to hear it. Now, from my perspective, being on base notes, typically the discussion about gender goes like this. You have people that believe gender exists in perfume and that you should wear perfumes that are identifying to your gender. And then you have people who say that gender doesn't exist in perfumes, that you can wear whatever you want, no consequence, it's all a lie, don't drink the Kool-Aid, I tend to have a middle of the road view on this, which sometimes makes me unpopular on both sides. And the reason why I have a middle of the road view is that I understand that not all perfume comes from the same place, and perfume itself is a cultural construct. Therefore, any gender expressed through that perfume is also a cultural construct that requires context to fully understand. See, principles are for soldiers, context is for kings, okay? That's a Star Trek quote. If you watch Star Trek, you know. Principles, rules, for soldiers. Context is for kings. So if you're a king, you appreciate what I have to say. If you're a soldier and you want to bark the dogma at me, then we probably are not going to have a level conversation. So, gender in fragrances, being as fragrances themselves are a cultural construct. When gender is expressed through a fragrance, it's gender being expressed through the lens of what the cultural standards were at that time, in that place where that fragrance was developed and released. So that right there sets you up for what you need to understand. So there are some cultures where gender traditionally was not expressed in fragrance. So especially if we're talking older styles of fragrance, more ancient types of fragrance. So For example, a lot of the oil-based perfumery that comes out of India and Southeast Asia, not gendered. There are a lot of very popular attars that are worn there by guys and women alike, and it's indiscriminate. The Middle East is the same way. There are a lot of fragrances from the Middle East, especially traditional ones, where the ingredients and the accords that create the smells of the fragrances do not communicate the gender of the wearer, and therefore are appropriate for just about anyone who likes those smells. That's it. Case closed. There's no argument there. You are allowed to perceive such fragrance as having gender for you. You can grab one of these attars, like a rose otto, or one of these other type of traditional fragrances, a sandalwood oil from India, whatever you want to do. And you can smell those and say, I think that's masculine and I think that's feminine. But it starts and stops with you. It starts and stops with you, because that fragrance was not created with gender in mind. So you can only apply gender to it for yourself. You cannot be the hand of God that comes down and rewrites the rules of someone else's culture that you're not a part of. You don't have permission to do that. Okay? So now, people who think they do have the right to walk into another person's culture and say you're wrong, and let me give you the correct answer, that sniffs at colonialism, which also sniffs at some very political conversations that I don't want to have. But we start going into things like racial superiority and cultural superiority and all that stuff, and divine right, manifest destiny, da-da-da-da. So if you're of that mindset, then you probably need to see your way out right now, because we were probably not going to be friends. But if you're capable of respecting other cultures you're not a part of, then we're cool, we can continue. So Western fragrances have an on-again, off-again relationship with gender, because a lot of Western fragrances, depending on what part of Western society they come from, whether they're European, whether they're American, whether they're coming from the United States, the UK, France, Italy, wherever, gender concepts are not unilateral. Okay, even though Europe is all lumped together into the European Union outside of the UK, which left the European Union, they're not all one big country. They are still each individual cultures that all have their own protocols and ways of seeing things. So even then, you just can't be like, all European perfume is like this. You can't do that. That's impossible. You won't win that argument. So what I can say is that because gender expressed in perfume requires that context, the time period, the place of origin, what kind of rules apply to society back then. If you can apply those things, then you can understand why something would be seen as masculine or feminine from that point of view. Now, the problem is time can change things. Culture is not static. Culture is constantly changing. At one point in time, pink was considered for boys and blue was considered for girls. And at some point, I think the Victorian era, they got switched out. Blue became for boys and pink became for girls. And things haven't really gone back since. I mean, a little bit, but other things, fashion, fashion is also a cultural construct. So we decide collectively as members of a given culture whether dresses are for girls and pants are for boys, or in some cultures where they wear kilts, which could resemble dresses to someone who doesn't know better. You might see someone in a kilt and go, hey, he's wearing a dress, if you don't know how Scottish culture operates. You see where I'm going there? It becomes a slippery slope here. So you need the context, and you need the time as well as the place to understand the context. Now, in general, when gender was applied to fragrance, which wasn't always the case, even in Western fragrances, for the longest time, various colognes and perfume oils and essential oils were just sold to anybody who wanted to buy them, because perfume was actually more about class representation than gender. The thing that people don't realize is that fragrance wasn't gendered for the longest time in Western civilization, because fragrance was something that the average person couldn't afford anyway. So there was no need to gender it, because the number of people that could even afford a fragrance to begin with was so small a number that they probably just didn't care. They were willing to share, you know. We're talking wealthy merchant families, we're talking noble families, people that had titles. They were the ones that were getting perfumes commissioned for them, you know. Everyone else, if they were wearing anything at all, it'd be a single oil of this or tincture of that they probably picked up from a candle maker, from an apothecary, you know, something like that, you know. Eau de Hungary was a recipe, okay? It was a recipe. You could figure out how to make it yourself and wear it, okay? That's how perfume was. So the real complex, oftentimes bespoke fragrances didn't have gender because they didn't need to, because there wasn't a lot of people wearing them. Once fragrances started to become a little more proliferate, we're talking 18th, 19th century, the advent of eau de cologne was a big help for that. They were still shared. You know, everyone loved wearing Farina eau de cologne. Everyone loved wearing 4711, okay? Once lavender waters became popular in the United Kingdom, everyone loved wearing the lavender waters, okay? Atkinson's, Yardley's, it didn't matter. You know, Yardley's English lavender was for anybody who liked the smell of lavender. It didn't really matter, you know? So that's how it was. And really, gender didn't play a role in the marketing of fragrance until there were enough people buying them that people were starting to run into one another. And you had a situation where you would have a guy going, oh, well, there's a lady that smells just like what I'm wearing, and I don't want to smell like her. I don't want folks thinking that I'm feminine, so I need something different. And probably women felt the same way too. Oh, well, this guy's wearing the same thing I'm wearing. I don't want to feel like I smell like a guy, right? So before long, you started seeing some things that were gendered, but it really begins with men more than women. Women didn't really seem to care as much. Women have always been traditionally a little more casual with perfume anyway. Guys are the ones that, guys get all riled up and they get like, oh, well, this is my identity, this is who I am and all that stuff. So they get real like into it. So they need to have that line drawn in the sand. Guys were like, I need something that is for men, that is out and out, forthright, red-blooded, lion-hearted, male, manly man. I need that. So perfumers in those earliest days of the gender divide didn't necessarily know how to go about doing that. They didn't have any idea of what smelled masculine, right? They just didn't know. So a lot of times they had to base what they thought was manly off of the products men were using. And this can lead into another video I will do later about barbershop fragrances. But a lot of times, what was seen as masculine really became, well, what do men already smell like? What do they already smell like? So in the UK, that meant a lot of bergamot, because guys love bergamot. That meant a lot of lavender, okay? Guys liked pine in Italy. Pine was a big thing in Italy. Also citruses and bergamot and lemon too. You know, in the early Americas, United States, people liked real powdery florals. Jockey Club was a style for a long time in the 1800s. So, and eventually stuff in the United States began to evolve more along creamy, foamy, rich, vanillic vibes, you know, things that reminded men of the products they were already using. Bay rums became very popular for guys in the Americas because of the trade with the Caribbean. St. Thomas, and the whole idea of bay rum itself is probably worth a video. So you get my point. These practical products, these wet shaving products, these grooming products, eau de quinine is another one. Smell of quinine became associated with men more so than anything else. Macassar was a hair oil that went into the hair to make it smooth and give it hold. So the smell of Macassar, which was also a perfume applied to the oil, it didn't have its own smell by nature. So you get where I'm going. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And eventually you would see a masculine style emerge. But this was all cultural, because once again, these smells, like the fougere, okay, like the citrus aromatic, all right, these fragrances just evolved from the products that men were already using, because again, the perfumers didn't really know where to go. Once the guys began clamoring, I want my own thing, I don't want to share, and some of the women too, I don't want to share with him, I don't want to smell like him. Then perfumers were kind of left with solve for X, right? They had to solve for X. And different parts of the world where that was a concern. Like I said, not every place has gender in perfume. So for places where it didn't matter. So they didn't solve for X. But in parts of the world where it actually mattered, or where it was starting to matter, the perfumers had to get creative. And that is why it is so important to have the context, because you need to know what was considered manly in Italy and Spain, what was considered manly in the UK, in the US, all right? France has always been kind of liberal in that. They don't really care so much. A lot of the early Guerlain fragrances, even the Guerlain fragrances made all the way into the 50s, were not gendered. Mitsoko was not gendered. Shalimar was not gendered. Okay, Opera's Lundi was not gendered. All right, none of those things. Nahima, not gendered. All right, so there was a man's fragrance made, Mouchoir de Monsieur, but that was an adaptation of Jiki, because Jiki was also not gendered, but a lot of men liked it. So the reaction to that was Mouchoir de Monsieur, all right? But a proper man's fragrance from Guerlain didn't even manifest until like 1961 with Vetiver. Vetiver was the first, So Caron's the same way. Caron had Pour un Homme, very, very landmark fragrance, because Pour un Homme was the first fragrance that was literally just called For a Man. That was the name of the fragrance. So even that fragrance, though, you smell Pour un Homme and you're like, what's so manly about this? Because if you don't understand the context, you don't know what the time period was like, you wouldn't get how that could smell manly, which leads me to my second point. Things change and evolve, as I mentioned earlier. So what may be considered manly now may not have been considered manly 70 years ago, and vice versa. What may have been considered feminine 70 years ago may not be seen as feminine now. That is why a lot of older guys in the online fragrance community, especially some of the older guys who I know on Base Notes who have been there since 2000, since the site first went online, a lot of those older guys will smell Invictus, they'll smell 1 Million, all the real sweet stuff, the sugary stuff, the real fruity, bubblegummy stuff, and they'll say it smells girly. Like, they'll say, that stuff smells girly to me. Even though you had these big dudes who were like stacked with pecs like this, and like, they're like 400 pounds and they can like bench press a freaking mini, right? They're like basically walls of steroids and muscle, but they're wearing 50 sprays of Invictus. So they smell like sweet, fruity bubblegum, but yet they could probably rip your spine out like freaking Scorpion from Mortal Kombat. So are you going to tell that man, hey man, you smell like a girl? Probably not. Not unless you want a quick, trip to the hospital, right? You wouldn't say that. So there again, vice versa. A lot of the fragrances that were marketed to women, especially immediately after World War II, that post-war era, where a lot of women were in factories, they were in law enforcement, they were postal workers, okay? So they moved into a more brusque sort of, kind of style. I mean, what you would even consider maybe masculine style. But that's what they liked. They liked tobacco, leather, stuff like that, green notes, because it reflected who they were, especially immediately after the war ended. They didn't just drop their jobs and all go back to the kitchen immediately. Okay, it's time to put the apron back on and become Susie Homemaker again. They didn't all do that right away. Okay, some of them stayed in that train of thought. They stayed in the factories. They stayed in the fields. Okay, so those fragrances were considered feminine back then, but you smell them now. You smell Bandy and you smell stuff like that, Miss Dior, and you're like, wow, that's really butch or really masculine, right? So now some people are going to squint real hard and go, well, no, it still smells feminine to me. But I'm asking you, are you smelling with your nose, or are you smelling with your perception of what you think male and female is based on what's written on the bottle? So you see the words Miss Dior on that bottle, and it's automatically feminine to you. But if someone were to spray that Miss Dior by Paul Vasher on a card and not tell you what it was, just spray it on a card, hold it behind your back and say, smell this. And you're going to be like, oh, that smells pretty masculine to me. You can play the same game with a lot of Bernard Chant fragrances in particular, because Bernard Chant was a big trickster, okay? Aromatics Elixir and Aramis 900 are like famously super close. So you can play the game where you spray aromatics on one card and the Aramis 900 on the other card. You've got 900 here and you've got aromatics here. You go like this, put them behind your back. You go up to a stranger who has no idea what 900 is, no idea what Aromatics Elixir is, and you say, smell this and smell this. And you ask them, which one of these is for men? Which one of these is for women? Some may say both are for women. Some may say both are for men. Some may say the wrong one. Oh, well, that one smells like it's for women and it's the Aramis 900. Oh, that one smells like it's for men and it's the Aromatics Elixir, right? You just don't know. It's a fun little game. You know, you're doing the whole Pepsi challenge, right? Except you're doing it with fragrances and you're making the challenge about gender. Now, unisex fragrances, we can touch upon those real quick. The whole concept of unisex fragrances is kind of silly to me, because just like I was saying how gender itself is a construct, we deem what is masculine or what is feminine based on our cultural values in the moment, where we are, when we are. Unisex fragrances play the same game, except now they're like, we're deciding what we think is appropriate for everybody based on what we know about what women and men like, you know, separately. And we're going to try to either combine these elements, or we're going to try to make a fragrance that doesn't contain either of these elements. So we saw some unisex fragrances in the 70s. Stuff like Eau Libre by Yves Saint Laurent. Stuff like Eau de Lancôme. Stuff like Ho Hong, which would later become masculine, but originally was unisex. Stuff like Sicily, Eau de Campagne. Okay, these fragrances were marketed unisex back then. And a lot of them tried to combine masculine and feminine traits together. Okay, Balenciaga, Ho Hong had masculine and feminine traits grafted together. Okay, so did Eau Libre. Eau Libre had masculine and feminine traits grafted together. Those fragrances were not terribly successful. Most of those got discontinued. I mean, Eau de Lancôme is still around. The Sicily fragrance is also still around. But a lot of the other ones, they died a sad death. They were not popular. Fast forward about 20 years, okay, now we're into the 90s, and we see CK1 come around, and then Paco would follow it, stuff like that. And those fragrances decided to do the exact opposite of, well, let's not combine masculine and feminine. Let's avoid all things masculine and all things feminine. Let's go with all the things in category C that were not claimed, you know, notes and materials and accords that were not claimed. Let's go make a fragrance out of those materials that's neither nor. Instead of either or, it's neither nor. And that's where you get CK1, and it kind of smells like a fluffy white cloud of nothing. It smells really good. It's Hedione and a lot of other materials, but it just kind of smells like a blank sheet of paper, right? It just kind of smells like, you know, BR540 does the same thing, actually, but in a whole different way. But BR540 also kind of smells like nothing. It's just completely abstract, all right? So it has no real reference point in anything naturalistic for you to go, that's male, that's female. So those fragrances are unisex on virtue of the fact that they either go either or they go neither nor. And that is something that tends to age very poorly in time, you know. Like, the longest time, I think, more women wore CK1, and then eventually kind of flip-flopped and more guys began to wear CK1. Now I kind of don't know where it is. I don't know where it sits, honestly. But there you have it, guys. That's gender. Gender in fragrance. It's an entirely constructed concept because fragrance itself is entirely constructed. So you can think it exists or doesn't exist. You can think there are rules or there aren't rules. Whatever you want, as long as you realize that perfume itself is a construct. So any value we associate with it, rich or poor, male or female, all that stuff, that's all informed by the context of culture, when and where the perfume was made. This has been the On List. Have a good one.